Trump has only really been consistent about one thing in politics since I've heard him active in that area, which is he won't criticise Putin. Every other world leader, whether it's Xi or even the North Korean leader, he will express different views about over time. I actually think that Donald Trump probably wants to run America in the way that Putin runs Russia.
Welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Dean Obidala, and today I'm with Chris Steele, a British diplomat served in Britain's MI6, known, I think, by many for the Steele dossier, and has a brand new book out, Unredacted, Russia, Trump, and the Fight for Democracy. Chris, welcome to Salon Talks. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you very much, Dean. I'm delighted to be back in America after a rather too long a stay away and to be promoting my book.
It's a very compelling book. And let's start off first a little bit about you, then we'll get to the Steele dossier and looking forward.
Sure.
What first interested you in becoming involved in British intelligence?
I think I had been born abroad and brought up abroad, and I was very aware, I think, of the world around me and the world outside. And my parents had served in some fairly eventful places in Yemen initially, where there was a sort of rebellion going on. Subsequently in Cyprus, where all sorts of things unfolded, including the division of the island. And of course, Cyprus is a big issue in the Middle East. It's very close to Lebanon and Israel and Egypt. So I think my interest in international affairs was obvious. It was what I'd lived. I'd lived abroad. I think the interest in politics came through my family and the traditions of my family. And I think once you mould those two together, you end up in international affairs and diplomacy and intelligence.
I think it's interesting in the book you talk about there's a moment early in your career that you have a choice to make between learning Russian or Arabic. Obviously you picked Russian. Did you ever think about what if you just picked Arabic and how different your life would have been?
There are a number of moments, crossroads if you like, including where you get posted to, of course, as a diplomat, which do determine what you then become expert in and how your career progresses. So yes, it could have been very different, but it was what it was. And I sort of feel in many ways that I've ended up in the right place at the right time, or some might argue the wrong place at the wrong time. But if you follow me, sort of, there's a fateful element to this, I think.
And, you know, in your book, you go through a great deal when you're living in Russia. You're there
Yes.
during the Soviet Union and the fall of the Soviet Union. You talk about the rise of this relatively unknown guy, Vladimir Putin. Can you share with people, like, what are the goals of Putin with regards to NATO and the EU?
The thing that's important to understand about Putin is he's an opportunist, and he's a tactician, not a strategist. So I think when he came to power in 2000, he did not have the same objectives and aims and goals that he has now. And I think one of the themes in the book, obviously, is that it's our failure to engage with Putin and Putin's Russia effectively that has led to this growing ambition that he's got now, where he's interfering in various elections around the world, where he's conducting a major war on European soil for the first time in 2 or 3 generations, where he's conducting sabotage and assassination operations. His goal is effectively a zero-sum game with the West. He realizes that the Western way of life, the rule of law and everything else, is inimical to the way he wants to run Russia. And he's determined to get Russia forward at the expense of the West. Ultimately, he would like to go down in history, I think, as the Russian leader who effectively rebuilt at least parts of the Soviet Union after the liberals like Gorbachev had dismantled it in what he sees as a disastrous fashion.
And you also write about this in the book, you know, in past Russian leaders, when they've failed in these kind of military expeditions or even wars, they usually don't have a long life. Their leadership kind of comes to an end. How much pressure is there on Putin in Ukraine, and how much does that interplay with Donald Trump, who during this campaign has kept saying he'll end the war immediately, which I would have to think that would mean a surrender. So how does that all intertwine?
Putin will be judged by the Russian people and by history as to what unfolds in Ukraine. And there's no question that where we are now, 2.5 years into the war, is not where anyone would have really expected him to be, including himself. He genuinely believed, because he'd been misinformed by his security and intelligence services, that it would all be over in a week or two. And frankly, if you'd asked me back at that stage, you know, if there's a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, how long would it take them to overwhelm the country? I would say 2 or 3 months. So the Ukrainian resistance and the Ukrainian opposition to this has been extraordinary by any standards. And I think that anything that gets Putin off the hook in Ukraine, that delivers at least something of a victory, something of a win for him, it would be catastrophic for the rest of us, and particularly those of us in Europe living in democracies.
So let's talk about the Steele dossier, because people know your name from that. I know that wasn't the formal title of it. That's not what you called it in your book. You had the formal title. Can you share with people, how did you first get approached to work on what this dossier was, and what was the goal of it?
It's important to understand that what we do in my business is we look at the world, as it were, through the Russian end of the telescope. Mm-hmm. We're not looking at American internal politics or British internal politics or even French internal politics. We're looking at those politics from either the Russian end of the telescope or the Chinese end of the telescope. And in this case, it was very much obviously the Russian end of the telescope. And what we had done before, as I explained in the book, we did the dossier, and probably the reason we were asked to write the intelligence up and run the intelligence sources we did, was we'd done a prior study of what the Russians were doing in European elections in, I think, 6 countries, including the UK. And it was off the back of that we realised that we were on something quite big. And so when Fusion GPS, who we were already in touch with and had worked with on other things, came to us and said, can you do this work on our election, as you've done other work on European elections, we obviously said, yeah, we think we can, we've got the capability.
And what was, just so people understand, because people know the Steele dossier by name, there's a salacious part, we can touch on that in a second, but when it was like Glenn Simpson and Fusion GPS comes to you and sits down, what was their mandate? Like, what did they want you to gather?
They wanted us to look at, as I said, from the Russian end of the equation down the telescope into the American election. What were the Russians trying to achieve? Who were the main actors? What were their objectives? How far they were being fulfilled? Et cetera, what measures they were taking to cover their tracks, which is an important thing in all these operations that Russia does, plausible deniability. Mm-hmm. And so with our expertise, and particularly I think my knowledge and experience of dealing with Russia, that was the obvious place to come for us to work on it.
So the Steele dossier, if you ask people now, they all bring up the part about the hotel room with Donald Trump and prostitutes, golden showers and stuff. Can you share with people, because no one knows at this point, because we've forgotten. Was that true? If it was not true, do you have any idea where this allegation came from?
We judged that it came from credible sources and not just one source. We also know, of course, that this is the Russian modus operandi. This is how the Russian intelligence services work. And that wasn't widely known, perhaps, until this particular report became public. And since our report, since our work in 2016, as I again detail in the book, there have been other manifestations of this. We're never going to know fully unless and until this regime in Russia collapses and we get access to the files of its security services. And that goes to actually a lot of the questions that we could talk about at the moment. Hopefully that happens. It may never happen. But certainly it came from credible sources, and I felt duty-bound to report it in because, of course, it is, as I say, part of the Russian intelligence's playbook. If they have leverage over a political leader in the West of any sort, that is significant and a worry and a concern for our national security. And that was the thinking behind sharing that with the client.
So when, we're in the middle of the 2024 campaign right now. I mean, we're winding down, to be honest. In all the evidence and gathering of intelligence that you've seen, objectively, is there a concern that you have as a former intelligence officer that there is compromise or blackmail material that Putin has on Donald Trump?
Absolutely. I think if you look at the history, and particularly if you look, for example, at the history of the Trump Tower project and other things, it's clear that Trump was quite heavily engaged with Russia in the period before he sort of entered really active politics. And so that has to be a concern, I think. And also he wasn't honest about it. The fact that negotiations on Trump Tower in Moscow were going on well into the 2016 campaign was never avowed. So I think there are a lot of things in the past. And the thing about Russian intelligence is they never forget anything. They never lose anything. They store things up. They use things. They have a very kind of patient approach to these things. They don't rush it, and therefore what they have on any politician or any leader can pop up years later and be used against them.
In your book, you go through and remind us of Donald Trump saying things during the 2016 campaign like, Russia, are you listening? To find me the emails. And then as president, standing with Putin at Helsinki over U.S. intelligence. In your mind, what did that flag for you? And did it increase your concerns that perhaps Putin has information on Donald Trump?
It's difficult to explain why Trump has only really been consistent about one thing in politics since I've heard him active in that area, which is he won't criticize Putin. Every other world leader, whether it's Xi or even the North Korean leader, he will express different views about over time. And that, of course, is the natural way with politics. So there is something very odd going on here. And I actually think that Donald Trump probably wants to run America in the way that Putin runs Russia, if the truth were known, and that probably underlies a lot of this. So there are significant concerns. It's very clear that Putin wants Trump to win, has done in each of the elections he's run in. That can only mean that he thinks he's going to benefit from it. And to explain why an American president would be so concerned about what a Russian leader thinks about him. And remarkably, I mean, you mentioned those two things. I think Helsinki was an extraordinary moment in American foreign policy, the history of American foreign policy. But even a couple of weeks ago when Zelensky was here from Ukraine, Trump made it very clear that he has a good personal relationship with Putin. Putin is now an indicted war criminal, and he's conducting an illegal war on European soil against allies of the United States. How do you explain that without there being something odd going on in the background?
You know, Vice President Harris, who's the Democratic nominee, has said that if Trump was president, Putin would be in Kyiv right now. Is that fair to say?
I think Putin would be in Washington right now, sadly. Whether Putin would be in Kiev, I think, is another matter, because I do genuinely believe that what we've seen in Ukraine suggests that Russia is not capable of defeating Ukraine in a whole-scale way. But I certainly think any peace settlement that came about would result in Ukraine losing a lot of its territory and really being scragged as a country. That's the way I see it.
When you look at this, where the United States stands right now, and we're one of the leading we're a democratic republic,
Yep.
But in the world, we're a leader in democracy. We help countries. If Trump were to win again, I don't mean this from a political point of view, sincerely as your expertise intelligence officer, what are your concerns for the United States?
Commenting on what happens inside the United States is not really my business
Right.
as a foreigner. But obviously what is my business and our business in Britain is looking at how close an alliance we have.
Sure.
And this has been an amazing alliance that's been so effective for generations since the Second World War. And anything that puts that trust and that sharing and that alliance in danger is of major concern to us in Britain, particularly those of us with a national security type background. I think the problem would be that, and obviously Western politicians can't discuss this in the way that I'm discussing it, but I know what they think, is that they are very fearful of an isolationist America, that all the things that we worked with America since the World War II, which has been so successful in peace and stability and wealth creation and everything else, would be up for grabs. You know, it's not just the NATO alliance and guarantees of mutual defence. Don't forget that the only time that the NATO Clause 5 or Article 5 has been invoked was by the United States when we came to your support after 9/11.
Yep.
And that's the sort of thing that could go down flushed away if Trump gets back in. I also think that things like trade tariffs would be hugely damaging to our wealth and to our trade and to our societies at the moment, particularly when economic competition with China is so great. So I think there are all sorts of ways, and climate change is another one. You know, I don't talk about climate change because I'm not an expert in it, but it's probably the single most important thing facing the world today. And the people around Trump and Trump himself are climate change deniers. And so that's another terrifying prospect.
Yeah, I think they should name the hurricanes that are here in the U.S. now Hurricane Trump, because he has rolled back Obama-era regulations. Yeah. He called it a hoax. Yep. He refused to fund things that would have lessened it. Yes, it is 4 years later, but still, you wonder the impact it has. You know, you mentioned something, and I think it's important. You're in a unique situation. You lived in Soviet Union, and you're in Russia. You're an expert in it. That Trump, in a way, in your view, this is not domestic political consumption, but more like analysis, but more, he looks at Putin, the oligarchs, that way of running things. What would that mean in the United States for us? Like, what can you share about what happened in Russia for Americans who don't understand what that would mean if a Putin-like character, if Trump really blossomed into that and elevated the oligarchs, you know, cracked down on dissent and the like?
Putin's not a normal politician in the way that we regard politicians. One of the mistakes I think that people like Angela Merkel and others made was to regard him as thinking in the same way that they did. He's basically a gangster who's come to power with his gang. Right. And all they're concerned about really is controlling power, controlling wealth, making sure that their children are able to inherit that wealth and carry on with that wealth. And so that sort of oligarchy is what might come to America if Trump were to be re-elected. Obviously, there are huge safeguards here, and one would hope that they held out. But the evidence so far is probably that only the judicial system, actually not the Congress and not the executive, are capable of keeping a president in check. And when you look at the decision that was made by the Supreme Court recently, that makes this a whole lot worse. Were you to get someone in the Supreme Office of President with those sort of powers and with that intent?
Yeah, I think things are lined up really awfully for America if Donald Trump actually got back in, because the control, there's no more checks and balances. You know, the Constitution was drafted with its checks and balances. They're gone. The legislative branch, if he controls it, the GOP, and judicial. What about if Trump wins? I'm not making light of this. I mean, you had to flee for your life in a way when you got outed in the UK. Donald Trump sued you. If Trump were to win, would you come back and visit the United States?
I'm not sure I would. It's interesting you raise those court cases, because one of the things that is very important to understand is that Trump has already sued me and my company twice, once in Florida in a class suit, a RICO suit, a racketeering one, which is absurd on its face.
Right.
And the second in London, where he's come to use a law that doesn't exist in the United States to try and sue us there, and failed. And in fact, in the London case, he lost 6 months ago. He had a cost order declared against him by our High Court, which he hasn't paid and shows no sign of paying, which I think tells us what he really thinks about the UK. And this is a country where, you know, he declares his love for the Queen, as it was, and his mother came from the UK. And yet he has no respect whatsoever for our legal system, or paying his dues when he loses in court. And it's extraordinary, really.
He has the same contempt in America for all of our systems, our institutions, our rule of law. We live in a country where the Republican nominee is convicted of 34 felonies for cheating in the 2016 campaign. And our corporate media doesn't think that's important to keep in every article, or that he's charged with felonies for attempting a coup. And we live here in this world where it's surreal to watch this. In Europe, last couple of things here.
Yeah.
In Europe, when they see the rise of Trump again, and he could win, and I think people who read Salon and understand that it's going to be a close election. In Europe, the Western Democratic leaders, are they paying close attention, and do they have the concerns that you've been articulating about where this country could go?
You bet. I mean, particularly those in Eastern Europe, which Putin would have his eye on, like the Baltic states and so on, Poland. The problem for Western politicians, obviously, is that they can't say anything about this. This is the elephant in the room, literally, the Republican elephant in the room. This is the dog that isn't barking in the night. But I know from conversations with people in government and in the intelligence services in Europe that they are petrified of the prospect of Trump coming back to office. The idea that he would go and do some geopolitical deal with Putin in quick step after an election victory. He was already talking about doing this with Zelensky before he even took office if he wins, which I think is another crime, isn't it? There's an act that you can only have one foreign policy running at one time. But he doesn't seem to care about that. But I can tell you that whilst you will not hear anything from Western politicians and European politicians at the moment and government ministers, were Trump to lose, there would be a very big sigh of relief. And a lot of us would feel that as well. And if you win, some of us might be seeing our ancestors can get us into the EU. Like my mom's side's Italian. I'm like, maybe I can do that. That's the world we live in, or is Canada is closer. We've learned, you mentioned American law, we've learned during the Trump period that these laws are suggestive. They're aspirational. And if no one's going to enforce them, it doesn't really matter. So we're really in an existential time for many Americans looking at what our system is and the checks and balances. Last thing is, obviously Vice President Harris, now the nominee. Joe Biden was going to be the nominee. In fact, he had won the delegates. How is that viewed in Europe, a potential Harris presidency? I think Harris is a bit of an unknown in Europe, to be fair. So we're looking very closely at what she says and what she talks about. She was speaking about Ukraine, I think, just a couple of days ago on television. That was very encouraging. I mean, she seemed to be wholeheartedly in favour of supporting Zelensky in Ukraine against Russian aggression. The problem you've got, I think, is that Harris would be, I'm sure, a good president, but you've got to get things through Congress as well. You can't get the aid packages through without having the House of Representatives. And the strange thing there is, you've got the chair of the Intelligence Committee in the House and the chair of the Armed Forces Committee saying Russia's interfering and we've got to stand up to Russia and we've got to give Ukraine the aid it needs. And yet over half the House of Representatives, Republicans in the House of Representatives, voted against the aid package. And at least half the Republican senators did, including sometimes twice. Once when it came to the House and the Senate, and once when it went back for approval. So you've got a massive problem in that it's not just the candidates for president. Trump's effect and impact on the Republican Party is such that at least half of it in Congress is prepared to back things which Putin wants, which is absolutely extraordinary. Given the national security history of the Republican Party,
yep.
the George H.W. Bush and Eisenhower and all the others, it is extraordinary we've reached this point, and it's very concerning.
Yeah, I mean, Ronald Reagan, obviously the great Satan, and tear down this wall to Gorbachev.
Yeah.
And this is not the same Republican Party. They should change their name, to be honest. It's like misinformation, it's false information at this point. Well, Chris, again, congratulations on the book. It's called Unredacted, Russia, Trump, and the Fight for Democracy. It's a great read, very compelling.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate your time, and thanks for being on Salon Talks.
Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you for watching Salon Talks. If you had a good time, why not subscribe right over here so you can get more conversations with your favorite artists, actors, directors, writers, comedians, musicians, politicians, everybody you love, and I love too. And while you're here, why not watch another video right now?